Welcome to All Right in Sin City, a podcast about writers and writing in the Windsor-Detroit region. Your podcasters today are
Sarah Jarvis, former bookseller, publishing rep, and literary festival chair.
Kim Conklin, Windsor-based writer and filmmaker.
and me, Irene Moore Davis, author, educator, and local historian.
Our featured guest today is Renée D. Bondy. Renée D. Bondy taught in women's and gender studies at the University of Windsor, where she facilitated courses on queer activism, women and religion, and the history of women's movements. Her writing has appeared in Herizons, Bitch, Bearings Online, and the Humber Literary Review. She is a graduate of the Humber School for Writers. Renée lives in Chatham, Ontario, and the book is inspired by events that happened there. Non-Disclosure is her first novel. Please note that this podcast contains a discussion of sexual abuse, which some people might find disturbing. Welcome to the podcast, Renée.
Well, thanks for having me.
In the afterword of your book, you talk about the fact that you asked yourself if the world needed another book on the topic of sexual abuse by Catholic priests. Would you like to tell us a little bit about your why for writing this book?
Sure. I really had to think long and hard about dealing with that subject matter. On a personal level, it's difficult to write about very traumatic subjects. So I really had to decide, did I want to spend a year or two thinking about and reading about child sexual abuse? Part of my reason for going ahead with the project was that there have been a number of novels written on the subject, but a lot of them pursued the subject either from the perspective of the priest perpetrator, or they dealt with the sexual abuse of young boys. And many of these are excellent novels. In Canada, Lyndon McIntyre's novel, The Bishop's Man, was really groundbreaking in that respect, and it won a lot of awards. It won the Giller back in 2009. I was really, really moved by that novel. And there are a few Irish writers, Sebastian Barry, a few others who've also written really great books on the subject, but none of them really entered into an in-depth look at the experience of girls who experience that kind of abuse. So I was really keen to kind of pursue that particular angle in this novel. I also think, in a very practical way, it's an ongoing issue. You know, since I started writing this novel, probably 3 or 4 years ago now, there have continued to be allegations, court cases within the Roman Catholic Church, both cases of individuals, and then of course we all know about the residential schools tragedies that have occurred in past years. So I really felt that there was a place for this book, that it belonged somewhere in writing on the subject.
The novel was inspired by events in your hometown of Chatham, which were also the subject of some of your previous journalism. How did you approach the research and writing for a work of fiction?
Mm-hmm. I certainly, at the time that there was a very significant court case here in Chatham with many victims and a particular Roman Catholic priest, I certainly read all of the press. You know, I watched the news like everyone else, and I did a lot of listening. I listened to people in the community and their reactions to the case. And at that time, I was writing for a small social justice newspaper. I had a little column with them, and I wrote about it a few times. And I never felt like I'd said everything I wanted to say. I spoke with people about their reactions to the case. I spoke to people within the church. I spoke to people outside of the church. I was really quite quite taken with their responses and quite moved by their responses. And I could really see how that case affected individuals and a larger community. So I thought about it for a very long time. This case in Chatham happened in 2006, and I started writing the novel probably in 2020. So it really stayed with me. And the research that I did back, a couple of decades ago remained as relevant as the research that I did in the last couple of years while I was writing the novel.
On the novel itself, at the age of 6, everything changes for the young girl at the center of the story. A new baby sister arrives, and the priest, known simply as father, begins the abuse. What were the biggest challenges of telling this story through the eyes of a 6-year-old?
Yes, and it's complicated because the novel is told by a young woman who is reflecting on her childhood. So it's told in fairly short memories, recollections, and because it's told from the perspective of a young woman, we sometimes hear her adult voice, but she sometimes slips into the voice and the language she would have used as a child. Right? As she delves deeper into these memories, we begin to get a sense of her voice, her views when she was 6 and 8 and 10 and 15. So it took a lot of experimentation with the voice when I began this novel. To be honest, I began writing in a plural voice. I began trying to write about the experience of a group of girls. And it was a challenge to write that way, and it was really interesting, but I didn't feel I could sustain it through the novel. So as I got to know her better, I think I became more comfortable, especially with presenting her story as a very young girl.
Another pivotal moment in the book is when she's in the 6th grade. In order to avoid being alone in a car with father, she asks an older girl for a ride home from choir practice. And on the way home, that girl tells her that everyone knows about, and I'm using quotes here, Father Feeler. This information fills her with a lot of questions. What is it about the community and child sexual abuse that you were exploring in this scene, that interaction between the two?
Yeah, I guess when I listened to people talk about the particular case years ago here in Chatham, and when I read other journalism, other novels about the subject matter, I came to see that often victims thought they were the only one, and that there was often a moment when they realized they were not the only victim. And in writing this novel, I had to really think about when will that happen for her, for our narrator. And I wanted it to happen with another young woman. And in the novel, the young woman sort of says this like, oh, this is common knowledge. Everyone knows that father, as he's referred to in the novel, is a predator. And the girl is so taken aback. Our narrator is so taken aback by this information because she thinks she's so alone. And I wanted that to be a pivotal moment in the novel. This doesn't move her immediately to disclose, to seek out other girls who might be victims. It doesn't change her day-to-day or her way of thinking about her own experience. But it's the first inkling that she has that she's not entirely alone.
The title, Non-Disclosure, comes from the agreement that the narrator's parents sign with the church years later, after their teenage daughter finally admits the abuse happened. How does that outcome, being paid off and silenced, change her relationship with her parents?
Again, it's complicated, isn't it? Her parents, as without giving too much away, her relationship with her parents becomes distanced. So I think her parents, in a sense, feel like they can put this behind them. right? And the non-disclosure agreement maybe gives them permission to put that behind them. This is in the past, it's been taken care of, there's nothing we can do about this. And of course, that's not the case for the narrator. You know, she lives this every day, she's traumatized by this, it affects her life, it affects everything that she does. So for her, the non-disclosure agreement is oppressive. It prevents her from moving forward. It prevents her from having conversations that might help her to heal from this childhood trauma. I chose the title rather quickly. I needed a title. I was applying to the graduate program at Humber, and I had to submit the work in progress, and it didn't have a title. And I thought, oh, wait, I can't submit this untitled thing. And I thought, oh, non-disclosure, that's a title. So I sent it off. And you'll see on the cover of the book that the prefix non is in square brackets. And I did that intentionally because I wanted us to think as readers about the larger theme of silence and secrecy in the novel. I wanted us to think about all the ways that silence is imposed and the way that it's sometimes chosen as well. And that's true of our narrator. She is restricted by that non-disclosure agreement. She's restricted by the fact that she feels she can't speak about her experience. But that's also protective for her. She, at times, is horrified by the thought that she might have to speak about this. It's also true, as we move forward in the plot, about the gay men with HIV/AIDS in the novel. And in the novel, these men with whom our narrator becomes very close access the services of an underground hospice. This is in the 1980s, when there was extreme stigma against gay men with HIV/AIDS. And in a way, the fact that this is an underground hospice, that we don't speak about this, that they're hidden, they feel is protective, understandably, but it's also oppressive. It also perpetuates the kind of widespread discrimination and homophobia that affected that community. So the title, I think, as I got used to the title, I could see that it was a really good fit for the book, not only because of the very concrete use of the non-disclosure agreement with victims, but also because of the larger themes of what we disclose and what we don't.
So I want to go back to your mention of the AIDS crisis and that underground hospice. So our main character's life changes when she graduates and gets a job at a local realty office. And the young owner, Neil, befriends her. And Neil is gay, becomes ill, and she gets more and more drawn to the AIDS crisis, as you mentioned. So you touched on this, but would you like to flesh out a little bit why you wanted to connect the two, not just with the title, the storylines, the sexual abuse storylines, and the HIV/AIDS crisis? What really knits them together for you?
Yeah. I'm not much of a planner when I write, so I get to know this character and she takes me places that I hadn't expected to go. So when I set out to write this novel, I thought, well, I'm going to tell this story about this young woman, the trauma she experiences in childhood, and how she begins to find ways to try to heal from this trauma. I knew she needed to find a community. I knew that her healing would take place in the context of community. I knew that at the beginning. I didn't know where she would find the community. I didn't know who those people would be. And when she meets Neil, I realized that he's going to be the person in her life that leads her to this community. And I don't want to give too much away about the novel and Neil, but he played this pivotal role for a very short time. And it is this underground hospice that the narrator becomes involved with that is her context for healing. And although the men who live at this hospice are very different from the narrator, her experience is not their experience. That's the community that she finds herself in, that she helps to create. And it's where she learns, I guess, that it's by helping others that we begin to help ourselves. She begins to reach out. She begins to be able to speak about things that are very, very difficult to voice. And she watches other people do the same. She finds support in that community. And she begins to be able to move forward from there. So it's a really, really transformative experience for her to get to know these men in this community. The timeline for the novel helped to facilitate this, right? The novel takes place in the 70s and 80s. And although the novel is very interior to the narrator's experience, every now and again, we have to look around and think, oh, what was going on in the world in the early 1980s? And certainly the HIV/AIDS crisis was front and center at that time.
Well, we're gonna play with timelines again here in this question. Finally, the narrator does become part of the court case against father, and she connects with victims to speak up about further abuse, but she also gets further abuse from the public and the media. If you were setting this story in the 2020s, do you think you might write that part differently, and why or why not?
Oh, absolutely. I hadn't gone there with that what if. I began in the early 1970s and I sort of stayed there. Yeah, that would require a whole reimagining, wouldn't it? To take into account how various forms of social media would affect the way people interacted with the case, the way victims interacted with each other. Yeah, that's a fascinating question. That's one that I'll really have to think a little bit more about.
So, the focus of the story is the aftermath of the priest's abuse, the fear and the shame that's been left with the victims. The most potent poison is the secret. What makes this kind of secret so damaging, and how does a secret coming to light help someone heal?
Hmm. Yeah, obviously it's very damaging because it's a kind of secret associated with profound shame. She blames herself for this abuse. She questions what she might have done differently. How could I have prevented this? What did I do to incite this chain of events? What should I do now that I'm not doing? You know, she questions herself all the time. In this particular case, we're dealing with abuse in the context of Roman Catholicism, and there's a way of thinking about girls and the expectations of girls in religious institutional culture, I guess we'd say. So girls are expected to be passive. Girls are expected to be obedient and pure and virginal and good. She grapples a lot with what it means to be good, and she doesn't see herself that way. So all of those feed into how damaging that secret is and how deeply buried that secret is within her. I'm not sure. Does that answer your question?
The story, and you've touched a little bit on this, the story is set in the 70s and 80s. And in your view, has our ability to, I know it's still going on, has our ability to protect young girls or all children from sexual abuse I guess within the context of the church, improved since then. What do you think we need to work on? Or if you're not comfortable with that, it's fine.
I'm not really sure how to answer that. The fact that there have been cases in the past few years tells me that certainly the institutional church has a long way to go. There have been calls by victims groups for the church to be more transparent, to release women from non-disclosure agreements, to be forthright about the nature of the covering up of abuse over the years. And I don't think that's happened, at least from what I read in the media and in other, sort of critiques of traditional religion. Your question was, do we do enough to protect young girls? I don't know. I'm not a parent. I taught at the university level. I didn't work with children. I don't really have a very good sense of that. I would like to say yes, but I don't know that I can.
Would you like to read a bit from Non-Disclosure for our audience?
Sure, I can do that. I'll read a little piece from fairly early on in the novel. I would say that our narrator is about 7 or 8 years old, and there is a scene in the novel where she's at a preparation class for her first communion. Her grade 2 class have to go to special classes in the evening to prepare for their first communion. And the class is run by Sister, and Sister instructs them about various aspects of the theology of the Eucharist. And I like this scene because we get a sense of this child trying to make sense of what is undoubtedly very complex theology, even for an adult. Sister showed us a film strip called The Eucharist. In the film strip, boys in black suits and ties and girls in miniature wedding dresses kneel at the front of the church, and a priest places tiny white communion wafers on their tongues. The priest looks like Father, but with a brush cut and horn-rimmed glasses. You can tell the children are worthy because they close their eyes as the priest comes to give them their wafers, and the priest smiles. And you can see, even in the film strip, that their thoughts are pure. When you receive the wafer, the Holy Eucharist, your thoughts must be pure, Sister told us. Holding on to pure thoughts is a feat of spiritual gymnastics. The only human with entirely pure thoughts was the Virgin Mary, who was born that way because of the Immaculate Conception. This, we learned in class, was the way God made Mary without sin. The rest of us, for thousands of years, have come up short, even Father and Sister, until they married God. Sister gave us bookmarks depicting the Assumption, a glowing Mary floating up to heaven, flying like Wonder Woman in her invisible plane. The soundtrack for the film strip was on a cassette tape, which made a ping when it was time to advance to the next image. Sister paused the tape so many times that we ended up watching the film strip for 3 weeks. The film strip required a lot of additional explanation so that we might fully understand the gravity of the situation. Children, Sister said as we stared at an image of Jesus whose heart was simultaneously bleeding and radiating beams of light. Look at the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Jesus' blood is pouring out for all sinners. Jesus died for your sins, but his body and blood live on in the bread and wine of the Eucharist. When we make our Holy Communion and receive his body, we must remember his sacrifice. Sister kept the hemorrhaging Jesus on the screen for a long time so we could consider this. I was mesmerized by the blood, but also confused about how one Jesus was turned into enough wine and wafers for every person in every church in the world. When Sister asked if there were any questions, I didn't ask, because I knew it was a mystery and therefore should not be questioned. Sister also explained the dress code for First Communion Day. The boys and girls in the film strip are wearing beautiful clothes, Sister said. But the film strip was made a long time ago, and we didn't need to wear dark suits and white dresses. Reform, said Sister, has come to the church. This meant that in 1973, God was okay with short-sleeved shirts and pants for the boys as long as they were clean and pressed, and nice dresses for the girls as long as they were not sleeveless or too short or too colorful. Don't draw attention, Sister told the girls. God sees you. That's what matters. Still, when First Communion Day arrived, Sister beamed at the few girls who dressed like miniature brides in white dresses and veils. They were immaculate, worthy of Jesus. In the final week of First Communion class, we did a practice run. Sister told us that the wafers we used for practice were not consecrated, which meant Father had not said the prayers that turned them into Jesus' body. Still, Sister warned us, these are holy wafers. We were to be silent and stand in a line and keep our hands to ourselves. We moved forward one step at a time until we reached the front of the line and closed our eyes and stuck out our tongues. Sister assessed them. Too far, she said, or a little more, until we presented just the right amount of Jesus-worthy tongue on which to set the wafer. The wafers tasted like white glue, not at all like Wonder Bread, which is what you would expect. We were warned, do not bite the wafer. This is the body of Jesus, not a cracker. So we had to let it dissolve. Chewing was forbidden. However, when I retracted the wafer, it adhered to the roof of my mouth, and though I tried and tried, there was no way to pry it off with my tongue. Later in bed, after I had brushed my teeth, I used my fingernail to scrape the last of it away.
Thank you for that lovely reading, Renée D. Bondy, and the name of the book is Non-Disclosure.
Well, thanks for having me. This was fun.
Thanks for joining us. Look for more episodes of All Right in Sin City wherever you listen to podcasts, or check out our website, allrightinsincity.com. For information and announcements of new podcasts, sign up to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.